The ship slipped its moorings before dawn, not with celebration, but with silence. Dock workers stood back from the quay, hands idle, watching a hull they knew too well drift toward open water. The tar along her seams was still wet, hastily brushed on to hide what rot and fatigue could not be repaired in time. Her decks sat unnaturally low, burdened by cargo stacked beyond safe measure, barrels pressing against planks already strained. Below deck, the air was sour with damp timber and sickness, and men who had slept little rose to stations they did not trust would hold. No prayers were shouted, no cheers followed her departure. Those left behind understood something that the paperwork and orders denied. This ship should not have sailed. Every port had known moments like this. A vessel cleared by officials, signed off by merchants, and pushed into the sea despite whispered objections from shipwrights and sailors alike. The danger was rarely dramatic at first glance. The masts stood, the rigging held, and the tide carried her outward as it always had. Yet experience told a different story. Experienced Hans noticed the way the hull flexed against the swell, the sluggish response of the rudder, the way water already seeped into the bilge. These were not omens born of superstition, but warnings learned through loss. Ships failed not because the sea was always violent, but because decisions made on land had already condemned them. Ports were places of relentless pressure. Merchants calculated profit by season and wind, knowing that a missed departure could mean ruin. Naval authorities measured success in timetables and appearances, fearing delay more than disaster. Inspectors moved quickly, glancing where they should have lingered, signing forms where questions should have been asked. A ship did not need to be seaworthy in truth. It only needed to appear ready long enough to leave harbor. Once beyond sight of land, responsibility dissolved into the vastness of the sea. For sailors, the moment of departure carried a weight unlike any other. Many had walked the docks the night before, running their hands along planks they trusted less than the ground beneath their feet. They had smelled decay beneath fresh paint, felt soft timber give under pressure, heard the creak of overstressed beams. Some spoke up and were ignored. Others remained silent, knowing that refusal meant blacklisting, imprisonment, or hunger. The sea was dangerous, but the shore offered no safety for those without work. Sailing on an unfit ship became a gamble, forced by circumstance rather than choice. The danger began immediately. Even in calm weather, a compromised hull worked against itself, seams widening with each swell. Overloaded cargo shifted with the ship's movement, straining beams never meant to carry such weight. Pumps were tested sooner than expected, manned longer than planned. Fatigue set in before the first storm ever formed. These early signs rarely reached those who had ordered the voyage. The horizon closed behind the ship, and with it any chance of reversal. The human cost was present from the first day. Below deck, men slept packed together among cargo and supplies, breathing air that thickened as hatches remained closed against spray. Dampness seeped into clothing and bedding, encouraging sickness that spread quietly before it was acknowledged. A ship that should not have sailed often carried illness aboard from the start, a consequence of overcrowding and poor provisioning. Disease did not wait for long voyages. It took advantage of weakness immediately, turning fatigue into fatal error. Leadership aboard such ships was rarely united. Captains bound by orders and contracts often knew the risks, but believed obedience left them no alternative. Officers enforced discipline even as doubts gnawed at them, aware that any admission of fear might unravel authority. Sailors watched closely, measuring every decision against their own unease. Trust eroded quickly when the ship itself inspired none. The tension was not loud or dramatic. It settled into the routines of watch and labor, a constant undercurrent of apprehension. These departures were not accidents of ignorance. Knowledge existed, Shipbuilders understood limits of timber and design. Mariners knew the seasons, the signs of decay, the consequences of overload. Yet the system rewarded departure, not caution. A ship lost at sea could be explained away as misfortune. A voyage delayed on land demanded justification, accountability, and expense. Over time, this imbalance trained entire institutions to accept loss as routine. Ships that should never have sailed became an expected, if unspoken, feature of maritime life. Those left behind carried their own burden. Families watched sails vanish, knowing the risks that had been ignored. Dock workers returned to repairs already scheduled for other ships, aware that they might soon be tasked with patching another vessel in similar condition. The port moved on quickly because it had to. Trade did not pause for grief, and navies did not wait for certainty. The sea absorbed consequences that society refused to face directly. The first hours of such voyages were often deceptively calm. The coastline receded, routine settled, and hope lingered despite misgivings. Yet every creak of the hull, every unexpected leak, reinforced the truth that the most dangerous moment had already passed. The decision to sail had been made, and it could not be undone. Storms, reefs, and distance would later be blamed, but the real turning point lay in that quiet departure, when warnings were acknowledged and dismissed in the same breath. These ships carried more than cargo and crew. They carried the weight of human compromise. Each plank ignored, each inspection rushed, each order prioritized over safety accumulated into a single outcome. The sea would eventually take its share, as it always did, but it was land that sealed the fate of these vessels. The tragedy of ships that should never have sailed begins not with wreckage, but with agreement, an agreement to look away, to proceed, and to accept loss as the cost of doing business. As the ship disappeared beyond the breakwater, those on shore turned back to their work. Those aboard turned toward open water. Between them stretched an understanding neither side voiced aloud. Whatever happened next would no longer be questioned. The voyage had begun, and with it the slow unfolding of consequences already set in motion. Once the ship had cleared the harbor, the decision that mattered most had already been made, long before the first rope was cast off. That decision rarely belonged to the men who sailed her. It was made in counting houses heavy with ledgers, in offices where the smell of salt never reached, and in meetings where time, not safety, dictated every outcome. The sea would later be blamed for what followed, but the true force driving these voyages was neither wind nor weather. It was profit, calculated precisely and pursued relentlessly. Maritime trade operated on narrow margins shaped by seasons, markets, and competition. A ship delayed could miss favorable winds, arrive after prices fell, or lose an entire trading year. For merchants, a vessel sitting idle in port represented capital wasting away. Repairs cost money, replacements cost more. Every day, a ship remained docked increased pressure to declare her fit, regardless of what inspections revealed. In this environment, seaworthiness became negotiable, a variable adjusted to protect balance sheets rather than lives. Ship inspections existed, but they were often compromised by urgency and influence. Inspectors were paid by the same interests that demanded departure. Their role was not to prevent voyages, but to legitimize them. A hull deemed serviceable did not mean sound. It meant adequate enough to justify sailing. Rotten beams were reinforced just enough to pass cursory examination. Leaks were patched instead of traced. Structural weaknesses were recorded in reports that no one intended to read closely. The ship gained her clearance, and the paperwork absolved those who signed it. Cargo decisions revealed the same priorities. Ships were loaded beyond design limits because empty space represented lost profit. Barrels of grain, spices, sugar, or manufactured goods were stacked higher and tighter, reducing stability and freeboard. Ballast was adjusted not for safety, but to accommodate additional weight. The ship rode lower in the water, sluggish and vulnerable, yet no calculation accounted for this beyond the immediate value of the goods carried. The sea would be expected to accommodate the excess. Insurance reinforced this logic. By the early modern period, maritime insurance had transformed loss into a financial calculation. Ships could be lost, crews could die, and cargo could sink, yet ledgers could still balance. Premiums rose, policies adjusted, and trade continued. For large companies and wealthy merchants, the loss of a vessel was often less damaging than the loss of opportunity caused by delay. Insurance did not encourage recklessness, but it softened consequences enough to make risk acceptable, even routine. The people most aware of these compromises were those who labored closest to the ship. Shipwrights saw the strain in aging hulls and understood how little reinforcement truly accomplished. Dockworkers felt timbers flex under loads that exceeded safe limits. Sailors noticed how the vessel responded to tide and swell even before leaving harbor. Their warnings rarely carried weight. They were replaceable, while ships and cargo represented concentrated capital. The hierarchy of value was unmistakable. For sailors, this imbalance shaped every choice. Speaking out risked dismissal, blacklisting, or worse. Many had families dependent on wages earned only at sea. Shore work was scarce and poorly paid. The option to refuse a dangerous voyage existed mostly in theory. Men signed on knowing the condition of the ship, calculating their chances against the certainty of hunger if they did not sail. Survival became a matter of probability rather than protection. Captains occupied a precarious position within the system. Officially responsible for the ship, they were bound by contracts, investors, and orders from distant authorities. A captain who delayed departure risked accusations of incompetence or disobedience. Promotions, reputations, and future commands depended on compliance. Some protested quietly, requesting repairs or lighter loads, but their objections were often overruled. Others convinced themselves that skill and experience could compensate for structural flaws. The sea would judge that belief harshly. Once underway, the cost of prioritizing profit revealed itself quickly. Overloaded ships responded poorly to wind, their hulls straining as waves struck with greater force. Leaks appeared earlier and required constant attention. Pumps became essential rather than precautionary. Fatigue accumulated as crews worked longer hours simply to keep the ship afloat. These were not extraordinary conditions brought on by storms, but the everyday consequences of decisions made to maximize return. Disease spread more easily aboard such vessels. Overcrowding below deck, dampness from persistent leaks, and inadequate ventilation created ideal conditions for illness. Rations were often reduced to make room for cargo, weakening bodies already strained by labor. Sickness diminished manpower, forcing healthy sailors to work harder, compounding exhaustion. A ship launched to meet a market deadline could become a floating infirmary within days. The economic logic that drove these voyages rarely acknowledged individual loss. Sailors who died were recorded as statistics or replaced without ceremony. Families received little compensation, if any. Companies absorbed losses through insurance or passed costs onto consumers. The system endured because it distributed suffering downward while preserving profit upward. The disappearance of a ship became an acceptable outcome, explained as the unavoidable risk of maritime enterprise. Ports reflected this normalization of danger. Departures were frequent, hurried affairs. Ships left in steady succession, each carrying its own set of compromises. The absence of a vessel weeks or months later was noted, but rarely investigated deeply. Trade routes continued to operate because stopping to question loss threatened the entire structure. The sea became a convenient explanation for failures rooted in human decision-making. This prioritization of profit over seaworthiness shaped maritime history across empires and centuries. Spanish treasure fleets, Dutch spice ships, English merchantmen, and naval transports all operated within systems that rewarded departure over delay. The specific goods changed, the flags differed, but the logic remained consistent. Ships sailed not because they were ready, but because waiting was more dangerous to those who owned them than sailing was to those aboard. The tragedy lies not in ignorance, but in acceptance. Knowledge of risk was widespread, yet discounted. Structural weakness, overload, and disease were recognized hazards, yet tolerated. The sea was harsh, but predictable in its indifference. What made these voyages lethal was not nature alone, but a human willingness to accept loss as the cost of efficiency. By the time a ship encountered its first serious challenge, whether storm, reef, or simple fatigue, the outcome was often already determined. The vessel carried within it the consequences of every corner cut and every warning ignored. The sea merely exposed what land had set in motion. Profit had been secured, at least on paper, and the reckoning was left to those far from shore. Thus, the story of ships that should never have sailed is inseparable from the structures that demanded they do so. Before rot weakened a beam or waves breached a hull, value had been assigned, risk accepted, and departure ordered. The sea would later be blamed for what followed, but the true origin of disaster lay in rooms where the ocean was never seen, and where the cost of human life was measured against the price of delay. Long before storms or reefs threatened a voyage, decay worked quietly within the ship itself. Wood, the foundation of maritime power for centuries, was never permanent. It absorbed water, expanded, contracted, and slowly surrendered to rot. Shipbuilders understood this intimately, yet economic pressure and constant demand ensured that many vessels were kept in service far beyond their natural lifespan. What could not be rebuilt was disguised, and what could not be disguised was ignored. Aging ships rarely announced their condition openly. Rot began deep within timbers where moisture lingered, spreading along beams and frames hidden behind planking. From the outside, a hull could appear sound, its paint fresh, its seams neatly caulked. Inside, supports softened, joints loosened, and strength diminished. Experienced shipwrights could feel the difference under their tools, hearing the dull sound of compromised wood where strength should have rung clear. Their concerns were often noted, then set aside. Repairs became a language of concealment rather than restoration. Damaged planks were patched instead of replaced. Weak frames were reinforced with additional timber that added weight without restoring integrity. Iron bolts were driven into wood that no longer held them securely. Each fix addressed symptoms rather than causes, creating ships that looked improved while growing more unstable. These were not mistakes born of ignorance. They were calculated compromises shaped by time, cost, and expectation. Shipyards operated under relentless pressure. Vessels were needed for trade seasons, military campaigns, or company schedules. Rebuilding a hull required months and vast expense. Patching could be completed quickly and justified as sufficient. Inspectors rarely dismantled ships to assess their true condition. To do so would halt operations and expose systemic neglect. Instead, they evaluated surfaces, trusting documentation and reputation where deeper scrutiny was required. The consequences of these practices were immediate once ships entered open water. Rotten frames flexed under strain, causing seams to open as the hull worked against waves. Reinforcements added weight but not resilience, increasing stress on already weakened structures. Leaks appeared where none had been anticipated, forcing crews to man pumps constantly even in fair weather. What should have been routine sailing became a battle against the ship itself. Below deck, the signs were unmistakable. Water pooled in bilges faster than expected, soaking cargo and provisions. The smell of rot and stagnant moisture filled confined spaces, seeping into clothing and bedding. Sailors slept among damp timber that weakened further with every passing day. Rats and insects thrived in the decaying environment, spreading disease and destroying supplies. A ship, patched for departure, began to dissolve from within. Crew morale eroded quickly aboard such vessels. Men recognized the sound of stressed wood, the groan of beams that should have been solid. Confidence in the ship, once lost, could not be restored. Every creak became a warning, every leak a reminder that their survival depended on structures already failing. This constant anxiety drained strength and focus, making mistakes more likely and recovery from setbacks harder. Captains and officers faced difficult choices. Acknowledging structural failure meant admitting that the voyage itself was a mistake, an admission that carried professional and legal consequences. Pressing on meant gambling that repairs would hold long enough to reach port. Many chose silence, hoping favorable conditions would spare them the need to confront the truth. Others documented problems carefully, knowing their reports might serve only to explain loss after the fact. False repairs also altered how ships handled at sea. Additional timber and patchwork changed weight distribution, affecting balance and maneuverability. Ships responded sluggishly to helm commands, turning slower and riding lower in the water. In heavy seas, this reduced ability to meet waves head-on, increasing the likelihood of flooding or capsizing. The very measures meant to preserve seaworthiness actively undermined it. The human cost of these decisions extended beyond those aboard. Shipbuilders forced to compromise their craft carried the knowledge of what had been sacrificed. Dock workers who rushed repairs knew the limits of what they had done. Families watched ships depart bearing signs of wear they had seen too many times before. These were shared understandings, rarely spoken aloud, but widely recognized within maritime communities. When such ships were lost, the narrative rarely acknowledged decay as the cause. Storms were blamed, navigation errors cited, or the sea itself held responsible. Rotten hulls left little evidence once submerged. Wreckage scattered or sank, erasing proof of neglect. The absence of survivors silenced testimony that might have revealed the truth. In this way, false repairs protected reputations as effectively as they hid weakness. Across empires and centuries, the pattern repeated. Spanish galleons repaired endlessly to maintain treasure flows. Dutch merchant ships patched to meet spice demand. English naval vessels kept active through successive wars despite visible deterioration. The logic was consistent. As long as a ship could float and carry cargo, it was deemed usable. Structural integrity became secondary to utility. These ships did not fail suddenly by chance. Their fate was set in shipyards where decay was acknowledged but tolerated, where repairs were designed to enable departure rather than survival. The sea did not need to be unusually violent to claim them. Ordinary conditions exposed extraordinary weakness. A moderate storm, a prolonged swell, or even the steady pressure of open water could complete what rot had begun. The tragedy of rotten hulls and false repairs lies in their inevitability. Once decay was hidden rather than addressed, loss became only a matter of time. Sailors boarded vessels already compromised, trusting craftsmanship that had been undermined by necessity. Their labor, skill, and endurance could not compensate for wood that no longer held together. As these ships moved farther from land, the consequences of concealment became harder to ignore. Pumps worked without pause. Repairs were attempted at sea with inadequate materials. Fatigue deepened, and hope narrowed to the possibility of reaching the next port intact. The voyage transformed into a slow unraveling, not because of sudden catastrophe, but because the ship itself had been sacrificed to expedience long before departure. In this way, false repairs did more than weaken hulls. They eroded trust in the very structures meant to protect life at sea. They represent a moment where appearance replaced integrity and where survival was left to chance. What followed was not an accident, but the natural result of choices made when a ship was declared ready, despite all evidence to the contrary. Even a sound ship could be doomed by what was placed inside it, and many that left port already weakened were pushed beyond any hope of endurance by the weight they carried. Overloading was not an error of ignorance, but a deliberate practice, driven by the same forces that excused rot and false repairs. Cargo represented profit in its purest form, measurable and immediate, and every unused space aboard a vessel was seen as wasted opportunity. The result was ships burdened beyond their design, sent to sea already struggling to remain upright. Shipbuilders calculated displacement and balance carefully, understanding how much weight a hull could safely carry and how it should be distributed. These calculations were well known in maritime communities, yet frequently ignored. Barrels of grain, chests of silver, bales of cloth, crates of spices, and even additional passengers were loaded until decks sagged and water lines crept higher than intended. Ballast was adjusted hastily, often incorrectly, in an attempt to compensate, but the margin for error had already vanished. The signs of overload were visible even in harbor. Ships sat lower in the water, their sides dangerously close to the surface. Freeboard, the distance between deck and sea shrank until waves could wash across planks in conditions that should have been harmless. Rudders responded sluggishly, and masts strained under altered balance. Sailors noticed immediately. They had seen enough ships depart under similar conditions and never return. Yet once cargo was secured and papers signed, their objections carried no weight. Below deck, overloading transformed living conditions into something barely survivable. Cargo-filled spaces meant for movement and ventilation. Hammocks were slung among crates and barrels, leaving little room to work or rest. Air grew stale as hatches remained closed to protect goods from spray. Dampness increased as bilges filled more quickly under the added strain. Illness thrived in these conditions, weakening crews before the voyage had truly begun. Overloading also magnified every other flaw aboard the ship. Rotten timbers bore weight they could not support. Patchwork repairs failed under pressure. Leaks widened as hulls flexed unnaturally. Pumps that should have been a precaution became a constant necessity. Sailors worked them in shifts, their labor consumed not by navigation or maintenance, but by the simple act of keeping water at bay. Exhaustion became a permanent state rather than a temporary hardship. At sea, the consequences grew more severe. Overloaded ships handled poorly in even moderate weather. They rolled excessively, increasing the risk of cargo shifting. When barrels or crates broke loose, the sudden movement could capsize a vessel outright or tear through internal structures. Crews attempted to secure loads with ropes and wedges, but these measures were often insufficient once the sea began to assert itself. What had been tightly packed in port became chaos under motion. Storms did not need to be extraordinary to prove fatal. A ship riding too low could not rise to meet waves, instead taking water over the bow and sides. Each wave added weight, further reducing buoyancy in a vicious cycle. Sails could not be adjusted quickly enough, and steering became uncertain. In these moments, the sea did not attack. It merely revealed imbalance that should never have existed. Human judgment faltered under these conditions. Officers faced impossible choices, whether to jettison valuable cargo to save the ship or preserve profit at the risk of all aboard. Many delayed too long, hoping conditions would improve. Others threw goods overboard only after stability was already lost. For sailors, these decisions were lived rather than debated. They heaved cargo into the sea knowing it might cost them wages, punishment, or worse, yet also knowing that hesitation could mean death. Overloading often intersected with desperation. Ships carrying enslaved people, convicts or soldiers, were crammed beyond humane limits, their human cargo treated as weight rather than life. These voyages combined physical instability with moral collapse. People were packed into holds where movement was impossible, ventilation inadequate, and survival uncertain even in calm seas. When ships foundered, these individuals were often the first to be lost, trapped by chains or locked compartments. The loss of overloaded ships was rarely described honestly. Official reports spoke of storms or navigation errors, avoiding mention of cargo decisions. Insurance claims listed quantities of goods, but not the conditions under which they were carried. The sea once again absorbed blame for failures rooted in human calculation. The pattern persisted because acknowledging overloading threatened the foundations of maritime commerce. For maritime communities, the consequences were deeply personal. Families waited for ships known to have left port riding too low, hoping experience and luck would prevail. Survivors from other voyages shared stories of ships nearly lost under similar burdens. These warnings circulated quietly, rarely reaching those with authority to change practice. The gap between knowledge and action widened with every departure. Overloading represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the sea. It assumed stability where there was none, control where uncertainty reigned. The ocean did not accommodate excess, it exposed it. Ships designed with careful balance in mind could tolerate stress, but those pushed beyond their limits carried disaster within them from the moment they sailed. By the time waves rose and winds strengthened, the outcome was often already decided. An overloaded ship did not need a catastrophic storm to fail. It needed only time, motion, and the relentless pressure of water against a hull never meant to carry such weight. The tragedy lay in the fact that this was known, understood, and accepted. As these ships moved farther from land, their burden became inescapable. Every mile carried them deeper into conditions that demanded flexibility and resilience they no longer possessed. Overloading turned voyages into slow-motion catastrophes, where survival narrowed with each passing day. The sea merely completed what human ambition had begun, revealing once again that some ships were doomed not by chance, but by design. Long before the first sail was raised, the men who would live and die aboard these ships understood the danger with unsettling clarity. Sailors were not naive participants swept up by romance or ignorance. They were observers trained by repetition, by memory, and by loss. They had walked the docks long enough to recognize the signs: hulls riding too low, repairs made too quickly, cargo stacked beyond reason. When such a ship prepared to sail, few aboard believed the voyage would be safe. Many believed it would be fatal. Experience at sea cultivated a practical awareness that no inspection could replace. Sailors knew how a healthy ship felt beneath their feet, how it responded to tide and wind, how it sounded when timbers held firm. They also knew the opposite: the groan of strained beams, the sluggish roll, the constant seep of water into the bilge were not abstract warnings but familiar preludes to disaster. These men had served on ships that never returned, had watched comrades vanish into storms or sink with vessels that failed under ordinary conditions. Knowledge of risk was not theoretical, it was earned. Yet knowing the danger did not grant the power to refuse it. Maritime labor existed within a narrow corridor of choice. Wages were paid only upon sailing. Shore work was scarce and poorly compensated. Debt accumulated quickly for those without steady employment, and sailors often lived one voyage away from hunger. Refusing a berth could mean blacklisting, a reputation for disobedience that closed off future work. For many, signing on to a compromised ship was not a decision between safety and danger, but between danger and destitution. This coercion was rarely explicit. Contracts were offered, not forced, yet the imbalance of power made refusal impractical. Captains and merchants did not need to threaten sailors. Circumstances did the work for them. A man with a family waiting for wages or debts owed at port understood that walking away carried its own lethal consequences. The sea might kill him, but poverty could starve those he left behind. Survival calculations extended beyond the ship's rail. pressed men faced even fewer options. Navies and companies filled crews through impressment, dragging unwilling sailors aboard and binding them to service. These men had no stake in the ship's success, yet bore the same risks. Their resentment and despair compounded the dangers of already compromised vessels. A crew that did not trust its ship and did not want to be there was less capable of responding effectively when trouble arose. Even those who volunteered often did so with resignation rather than hope. Sailors joked darkly about certain ships, naming them as doomed before they left port. These were not superstitions born of fear, but expressions of shared understanding. Gallows humor masked anxiety that could not be openly expressed. To voice serious concern too loudly risked punishment or dismissal. Silence became a survival strategy. Life aboard such ships reinforced this fatalism. From the first days at sea, crews confronted the consequences of decisions made without them. Pumps required constant attention. Leaks worsened rather than stabilized. Cargo shifted despite efforts to secure it. The ship itself demanded labor simply to remain afloat, leaving little energy for navigation or rest. Sailors recognized that no amount of skill could compensate for structural weakness and overload. Trust, the foundation of effective seamanship, eroded quickly. Sailors must trust their ship to withstand weather, their officers to make sound decisions, and each other to perform under pressure. On vessels that should never have sailed, this trust was fractured from the outset. Men questioned orders not out of insubordination, but fear. Officers sensed this tension and responded with stricter discipline, deepening resentment and undermining cohesion. In moments of crisis, hesitation and confusion replaced coordinated action. The psychological toll was immense. Each watch was marked by anticipation of failure rather than routine duty. Sleep came in brief, uneasy stretches, interrupted by the sound of water sloshing where it should not be. Sailors measured time not by progress toward destination, but by how long the ship had survived without worsening. Hope narrowed to the possibility of reaching the next port intact, even if the larger voyage remained uncertain. When disaster struck, these crews were often blamed. Official accounts cited incompetence, panic, or mutiny, deflecting attention from the conditions that made success impossible. Survivors who spoke of structural flaws or overload found their testimony discounted, dismissed as excuses offered after failure. Those who perished could not speak at all. The narrative of sailor error proved convenient, absolving those who had ordered the voyage to begin with. Families ashore sensed these realities without fully articulating them. Wives, parents, and children watched departures with unease shaped by past losses. They recognized certain ships as dangerous long before any news arrived. When months passed without word, dread settled into daily life. Grief, when it came, was often mingled with bitter understanding. The sea had taken their loved ones, but land had sent them unprotected. Across ports and generations, this cycle repeated. Crews boarded ships they did not trust because survival demanded it. Knowledge of danger circulated freely among sailors, yet rarely influenced policy or practice. Those most aware of risk were those least empowered to change it. Their courage lay not in ignorance, but in endurance, in choosing to face known peril because alternatives were worse. The tragedy of these crews is not that they failed to foresee disaster, but that foresight offered no escape. They sailed knowing the odds, carrying within them a quiet awareness that the voyage might never end. When ships that should never have sailed disappeared beneath the sea, they took with them men who understood exactly what was happening, and who had been denied the means to prevent it. Not every sailor who stepped aboard these ships did so by choice. Along the docks and taverns of maritime cities, the need for crews collided with shortages that could not be resolved through wages alone. When ships that should never have sailed prepared for departure, their decks were often filled not with willing hands, but with men taken by force. Impressment and coercion supplied labor where consent failed, binding unwilling bodies to vessels already burdened by compromise. Press gangs operated with legal authority in many ports, particularly during periods of war or heightened trade. Men were seized in streets, homes, or public houses and marched to ships without explanation or appeal. Some had never sailed before. Others were experienced mariners who recognized immediately the condition of the vessel they were being forced to serve upon. Knowledge offered no protection. Once aboard, escape was nearly impossible, and resistance invited punishment severe enough to deter others. These pressed men entered service without trust or loyalty. They had no stake in the voyage's success beyond their own survival, and often little hope of even that. Discipline replaced consent as the mechanism of order. Officers relied on fear to maintain control, tightening routines and enforcing obedience with severity. On ships already strained structurally and materially, this atmosphere of coercion undermined cooperation and morale from the outset. The presence of unwilling sailors affected every aspect of shipboard life. Seamanship depends on coordination, experience, and mutual reliance. Pressed men lacked motivation to perform beyond the minimum required to avoid punishment. Some sabotaged equipment quietly, others withheld effort, and many simply lacked the training needed for complex tasks. In calm conditions, these deficiencies might be manageable. Under strain, they became deadly. Forced service also intensified psychological stress. Men taken from their lives ashore endured a profound sense of dislocation and resentment. Below deck, confined among strangers on a vessel they had not chosen, despair spread quickly. Alcohol, when available, offered temporary escape, while arguments and violence became more common. The ship itself became a site of internal conflict, its human structure as unstable as its physical one. Officers were not immune to the consequences of this system. Maintaining order among unwilling crews demanded constant vigilance and harsh measures. Time and energy that should have been devoted to navigation and maintenance were consumed by discipline. In moments of crisis, officers could not rely on initiative or trust, only on commands that might not be followed quickly or effectively. The margin for survival narrowed further with each forced hand aboard. The dangers of impressment were well known. Naval authorities understood that unwilling crews performed poorly under pressure, yet the demand for manpower outweighed concern for efficiency or safety. Ships sailed with skeleton crews hastily filled by press gangs, lacking cohesion or shared purpose. These vessels were expected to endure long voyages, storms, and combat despite the absence of fundamental human stability. For pressed men, the sea offered no refuge. Escape attempts were met with brutal punishment, sometimes fatal. Illness or injury did not guarantee release. Even survival to the end of a voyage offered little relief, as many were immediately reassigned to another ship. Their lives became a continuous passage through danger, shaped by decisions made entirely without their consent. When disaster struck such ships, forced service amplified chaos. Men unfamiliar with their stations hesitated or erred. Orders were misunderstood or ignored. Panic spread faster where trust had never existed. In some cases, mutiny erupted not from ambition, but from desperation, a last attempt to escape a fate imposed without choice. These events were later recorded as moral failures rather than structural inevitabilities. The disappearance of ships carrying pressed crews rarely prompted reflection on the system that produced them. Losses were attributed to weather or enemy action, not to the human fracture aboard. Pressed men left no advocates behind. Their families often did not know where they had been taken, let alone where they had died. Their absence dissolved quietly into the rhythms of port life. The practice of coercion revealed a deeper truth about maritime power. Ships that should never have sailed often required men who should never have been forced aboard them. Both were treated as expendable components within a larger system of trade and war. Structural weakness and human unwillingness reinforced each other, creating vessels doomed by design long before they reached open water. As these ships moved farther from shore, the consequences of forced service became harder to contain. Discipline hardened, cooperation thinned, and fear replaced routine. The sea did not create these conditions. It merely exposed them. The tragedy of pressed men lies not only in their suffering, but in the way their presence transformed fragile ships into environments where survival was compromised from every angle. In the end, these vessels carried more than compromised hulls and overloaded cargo. They carried human resentment, despair, and coercion woven into their daily operation. When they vanished, they took with them lives that had never consented to the risk, bound to ships that should never have sailed, and sacrificed to a system that valued departure above all else. The sea did not need to be cruel to destroy these ships. It only needed to be honest. Vessels that should never have sailed often met their end, not in legendary tempests, but under conditions that a sound ship was expected to endure. Moderate winds, shifting tides, or seasonal storms revealed truths that had been hidden by calm water and favorable departure. When the weather changed, even slightly, the lie embedded in the ship's construction and preparation was exposed. Sailors understood this distinction with painful clarity. Truly violent storms were feared, but respected, recognized as forces no human design could fully withstand. What terrified experienced crews more deeply were the ordinary gales, the kind recorded routinely in logs and expected along certain routes. These were the tests ships were built to survive. When a vessel failed under such conditions, it confirmed what many aboard already knew. The danger had been present from the moment it left port. Overloaded ships responded poorly to changing seas. Cargo shifted as waves struck the hull, altering balance and increasing strain on already weakened frames. Water found pathways through seams stretched beyond tolerance, flooding holds faster than pumps could manage. The ship's motion became erratic, no longer predictable, exhausting the crew as they fought to correct problems that compounded by the hour. What began as discomfort escalated into crisis without a single dramatic event. Rigging failures often followed. Masts carried sails never meant to be borne by compromised hulls, and under increased wind pressure, spars cracked or snapped. Each failure forced dangerous adjustments, sending men aloft in worsening conditions to secure or cut away rigging. Falls were common. Injuries mounted. The ship lost speed and maneuverability at the very moment both were most needed. These moments revealed the cumulative effects of earlier decisions. Poor timber choices, rushed construction, deferred maintenance, and excessive loading converged under stress. No single flaw was responsible. The weather merely activated weaknesses that had been layered deliberately over time. Responsibility did not lie with the wind or waves, but with those who had certified the vessel as seaworthy, despite evidence to the contrary. As conditions deteriorated, fatigue became as dangerous as any structural failure. Crews worked pumps continuously, often in darkness, surrounded by rising water and the stench of rot. Sleep vanished. Hunger followed. Judgment suffered. Small errors multiplied, turning manageable problems into irreversible ones. Officers issued orders that could not be executed quickly enough. The ship's systems, both human and mechanical, approached collapse together. For pressed and unwilling crews, these moments were especially volatile. Resentment sharpened under stress. Cooperation eroded. Some men slowed their efforts, consciously or unconsciously, withdrawing from a struggle they believed futile. Others panicked, breaking discipline at the worst possible time. The absence of trust magnified every failure, accelerating the descent from difficulty into disaster. Even well-trained sailors found themselves powerless when design limits were breached. Seamanship could compensate for many dangers, but not for hulls that flexed too far, decks that sagged, or pumps that could not outpace flooding. The sea offered no margin for negotiation. Once water gained dominance, recovery became unlikely, regardless of skill or courage. Official records often describe these losses as acts of nature. Storms were blamed, even when conditions were unremarkable for the route and season. This language served to protect reputations and profits ashore. Admitting that ships had been unfit would invite scrutiny of practices that were widespread and lucrative. The sea became a convenient scapegoat, absorbing responsibility along with the wreckage. Survivors told a different story when allowed to speak. They described ships that labored from the outset, leaks that never stopped, and failures that unfolded predictably once weather shifted. Their accounts emphasized inevitability rather than surprise. Disaster did not arrive suddenly. It advanced step by step, announced by signs that had been visible all along. Families left behind struggled to reconcile these realities. News of loss often arrived stripped of context, reduced to a line about storms or misfortune. Those who knew the ship's condition felt anger rather than shock. They recognized that weather had merely completed a process already in motion. Grief mingled with a sense of betrayal, directed not at the sea, but at the system that had sent their loved ones out so poorly defended. In this way, weather functioned not as a villain, but as a judge. It tested claims of seaworthiness without bias or mercy. Ships that were built and prepared honestly endured. Those that were compromised did not. The pattern repeated across oceans and centuries, consistent in its outcome. As these vessels disappeared beneath waves that countless others survived, they left behind a distorted narrative that blamed nature for human choice. The sea's role was not to destroy indiscriminately, but to reveal truth under pressure. For ships that should never have sailed, even ordinary weather was enough to bring that truth to the surface and to carry it, along with the ship and its crew, into silence. Before storms struck, before hulls creaked under weight, and long before misfortune at sea could be blamed, another threat lurked quietly below deck: sickness. Ships that should never have sailed often carried disease from the very moment they left port. It was not an outbreak waiting for exposure. It was endemic, a slow poison embedded in crowded holds, damp timber, and contaminated provisions. The human body, weakened by cramped conditions and poor diet, became as vulnerable as the compromised vessel itself. The spaces below decks offered no mercy. Sailors and passengers were packed among cargo, their hammocks and bedding pressed into corners alongside barrels and crates. Ventilation was minimal. Stale, humid air hung heavy, clinging to the skin and lungs. Every breath carried bacteria or mold, thriving in darkness. Men who might have endured ordinary voyages fell ill from the combination of poor sanitation and exhaustion. This was not a sudden disaster, but an inevitable consequence of neglect and overcrowding. Scurvy, dysentery, and fever spread rapidly in these conditions. Fresh food was scarce, replaced by salted meat, dried biscuits, and stagnant water. Nutrient deficiency weakened immune systems, leaving even strong men vulnerable. Contaminated water and spoiled provisions carried gastrointestinal disease through the cramped corridors, attacking those already exhausted by labor. One cough could ignite an epidemic. One contaminated barrel of water could fatally alter the ship's balance between survival and decay. The crew's attempts to combat illness were often futile. Sick bay, where it existed, was minimal, usually nothing more than a corner of the hold with a basin and crude bedding. Remedies were improvised, sometimes outright dangerous. Bitter herbs, alcohol, or bloodletting applied indiscriminately. Sailors attempted care while simultaneously fighting leaks, manning pumps, and adjusting sails. Fatigue multiplied vulnerability, creating a cycle where sickness both caused and resulted from overwork. Captains faced impossible dilemmas. Removing the sick from work risked further weakening an already undermanned crew. Ignoring illness spread contagion through the ship. Decisions balanced survival of the many against the few, often without clear ethical guidance. In extreme cases, officers locked the sick below deck, hoping to prevent panic, only to accelerate death. These choices, dictated by necessity, reflected the impossibility of navigating human vulnerability in the confines of a compromised vessel. Disease aboard ship was not confined to the crew alone. Passengers, often pressed into voyages against their will, faced identical threats. Merchants, soldiers, and enslaved people shared the same air and water, breathing illness into every corner. The hierarchy of value affected treatment. Those with influence might receive slightly better quarters, while the marginalized were packed into the worst conditions. Mortality reflected social and economic structures as much as biology, emphasizing that disaster was shaped by human systems as much as by nature. The presence of disease compounded every other weakness. An overloaded hull became more dangerous when fewer hands were available to respond. Rotten timbers and false repairs demanded constant maintenance, yet sick sailors could not labor effectively. Pressed men, already unwilling or inexperienced, became liabilities when illness spread. The interplay of human frailty, structural compromise, and environmental stress transformed ordinary voyages into slow-moving tragedies. What was remarkable was how early these conditions manifested. Ships departing ports might be at full speed within hours, but illness often preceded the first storm by days. Crewmen weakened from poor conditions succumbed to infection before weather could test hulls or masts. For many, death was a certainty long before the first wave broke over the deck. In this way, sickness was a silent storm, invisible but relentless, claiming lives while the vessel sailed ostensibly safely. Families and port authorities were largely unaware of the scale of disease. Reports focused on departures, cargo manifests, and arrival dates. The deaths of men below deck went largely unrecorded unless they impacted the voyage directly. Survivors rarely documented the progression of illness, both out of fatigue and fear of retribution. In official memory, the sickness that claimed lives disappeared, leaving only the story of ships lost or delayed. Disease then became an inseparable companion of these doomed voyages. It was neither dramatic nor spectacular, yet its consequences were profound. Combined with structural weaknesses, overloading, and human conflict, it ensured that many vessels carried within them the seeds of disaster from the first hour of sailing. Survival depended not on skill or luck alone, but on endurance against a threat no sailor could fully control. By the time waves and wind compounded the ship's woes, disease had already thinned crews, drained strength, and magnified panic. What was invisible below deck now intersected with visible danger on deck, accelerating the breakdown of both human and material systems. Ships that should never have sailed were not merely unlucky. They were diseased from birth, burdened by human frailty as much as cargo, and condemned from the moment the first rope was cast off. The sea is a domain of precision, where small errors magnify with every mile, yet ships that should never have sailed were already burdened with uncertainty before the first navigational chart was even unfolded. Compromised hulls, overloaded decks, sick crews, and inexperienced or coerced hands all contributed to the growing probability of human error. In conditions that required constant vigilance and subtle judgment, mistakes became inevitable. Even the most skilled officers struggled to compensate for deficiencies that were structural, environmental, and human all at once. Celestial navigation demanded focus, discipline, and unimpeded observation. On these ships, the instruments often lacked calibration, and charts were sometimes outdated or poorly copied. Compounding this, sails and rigging stressed under improper loads made maintaining course difficult. Every adjustment of the helm or repositioning of the yards carried consequences. A miscalculation by a single officer could send the vessel off course toward hidden shoals, submerged rocks, or treacherous currents. The margin for error, always narrow at sea, had been deliberately reduced by decisions made before departure. Fatigue among crews amplified mistakes. Men weakened by disease, overwork, or inadequate food could not respond with the precision demanded for navigation and maneuvering. Even experienced sailors, alert under normal circumstances, found that exhaustion dulled reflexes, blurred judgment, and slowed response. A single lapse could allow a wave to strike in the wrong direction, a line to snap at the worst possible moment, or a course to be set incorrectly without immediate detection. Pressed and coerced sailors further destabilized command. Those without training were sometimes placed at critical stations due to shortage of personnel, and their errors could have cascading effects. Officers could issue orders, but execution depended entirely on hands that were unwilling or incapable. Confusion in such circumstances did not merely delay progress, it actively endangered every individual on board. Mistakes compounded rapidly, creating situations that might appear sudden, but were, in reality, the result of long-established compromises. Cargo too affected navigation. Excess weight lowered freeboard, slowing the ship's response to steering and reducing maneuverability. Shifting barrels and crates could alter balance mid-course, forcing corrective action that risked overcompensation and further error. Even the placement of ballast, calculated haphazardly in port to accommodate overload, could send the vessel off alignment. Navigation was no longer a precise art. It became a precarious negotiation between human skill and compromised design. Weather, even minor, exposed these miscalculations with merciless clarity. A sudden swell that a properly balanced ship could ride safely might pitch a compromised hull into disarray. Waves caused cargo to shift, sails to strain, and inexperienced sailors to falter. Officers faced the impossible: maintain course, secure cargo, and manage a crew that might not respond reliably. The sea amplified every human flaw, every unaddressed weakness, into near-certain danger. Even experienced captains were not immune. Years at sea could not erase the effects of compromised ship structure, overloading, or weakened crews. Decisions made under pressure were constrained by the very compromises that had been introduced at departure. Calculations of speed, drift, and wind resistance were unreliable because the vessel no longer behaved predictably. Every adjustment, every maneuver became a gamble with the lives of all aboard. When a ship ran aground, struck a reef, or was carried into shoal water, official records frequently attributed the failure to error or misjudgment. Yet such attributions obscured the broader reality. The human mistakes were symptoms of prior compromises. Sailors erred not out of incompetence, but because they were forced to operate under conditions that exceeded reasonable limits. Human error was a natural consequence of a system that had already ensured risk and danger. The psychological weight of anticipating error further influenced performance. Men aware of a ship's weaknesses often second-guessed orders, hesitated at critical moments, or became paralyzed by fear. Panic was not an isolated event. It was cultivated over weeks and months, a slow accumulation of stress, fatigue, and recognition of impending disaster. Even minor miscalculations, when layered upon this psychological strain, could trigger cascading failures that led to catastrophe. Through this lens, navigation errors were less accidents and more inevitable outcomes of human and structural compromises. The voyage that began in harbor had already set in motion conditions under which misjudgment became unavoidable. The sea merely acted as the arbiter, turning accumulated compromise into consequence and revealing with stark clarity that some ships were never meant to reach their destination alive. The lesson, etched into maritime memory, was harsh. The line between mastery of the sea and submission to it was defined not only by skill, but by the integrity of the vessel, the capacity of the crew, and the foresight, or lack thereof, of those who ordered her to sail. For ships that should never have sailed, every mile traversed became a ledger of human error writ large, each misstep a confirmation of what men had long known but been powerless to prevent. Some storms are sudden, violent, and impossible to predict. Others, however, are chronic, seasonal, and charted with centuries of observation. For ships that should never have sailed, disaster often came not from the unexpected, but from storms that could and should have been anticipated. These were the squalls and gales noted in port records, the seasonal tempests long familiar to captains, merchants, and mariners. To sail knowingly into them was an act of hubris or necessity, and both proved equally fatal. Preparation, when undertaken at all, was a compromise. Compromised hulls flexed and creaked under even modest swells. Overloaded cargo shifted unpredictably with the rising seas. Leaky planking allowed water into the hold faster than pumps could remove it. Crews already weakened by disease and exhaustion faced the impossible task of fighting the storm while maintaining the ship's structural integrity. In such moments, the sea did not discriminate between inexperience and expertise. It simply applied pressure to the weakest points. Captains faced impossible choices. Delaying departure might have avoided the worst conditions, but economic imperatives, contractual obligations, and the unrelenting need for profit often forced a voyage into weather that was known to be threatening. The very same logs that could have guided prudence became instruments of pressure. Cargo contracts, trade schedules, and insurance deadlines weighed heavily against caution. Risk was calculated, but the true cost, the lives of sailors, passengers, and the ship itself, was discounted. Sailors, aware of these patterns, anticipated trouble long before it arrived. Experienced hands recognized the darkening clouds, the rising swell, the scent of rain carried on the wind. Many took silent measures, double-checking lashings, shoring weak timbers, preparing pumps. Others whispered fears, hoping someone in authority would reconsider the order to sail. Such warnings rarely altered the decision. The ship's fate had been partially sealed by choices made far from the sea, and no sailor's foresight could fully counteract them. The first wave always revealed more than the storm itself. Ships heeled excessively, groaning under stress that should not have existed. Cargo shifted, decks tilted, and water entered through seams long weakened. Leaky pumps strained under the inflow, often failing just when they were most needed. Sailors worked tirelessly, but exhaustion, illness, and overcrowding meant that even heroic effort could only slow the inevitable. Storms magnified every earlier compromise. A rotten beam might hold in calm waters, but splinter under gale-force wind. An overloaded hull listed more dangerously when waves struck at angle, threatening to capsize or swallow entire sections. Human error, already a risk, became inevitable as fatigue and fear reduced coordination. The storm itself became both catalyst and revealer, demonstrating that the ship's failure had been written long before the first wave crashed over the rail. Inexperienced or pressed sailors faced particular peril. They could not anticipate how cargo would shift or how the hull would flex. Orders were difficult to follow, and hesitation could prove fatal. Even small mistakes, a line left untied, a hatch left unsecured, had amplified consequences in the chaos of a storm. In these moments, the human and structural failings of the ship converged, accelerating disaster. The psychological strain was immense. Sailors knew from experience that storms could be survived if the ship was sound, yet they also knew the vessel beneath their feet had already been compromised. Anxiety and dread became tools for survival, keeping men alert even as exhaustion threatened collapse. Panic, when it appeared, could ripple quickly through the crew, further endangering the voyage. The aftermath of storms that should have been avoided often revealed systemic failure more clearly than the waves themselves. Wreckage, when recovered, showed not only damage from wind and water, but the cumulative effects of poor construction, overloading, disease, and mismanagement. Survivors told stories not of divine wrath, but of human decisions made long before the storm arrived. The narrative of fate or chance obscured the deliberate compromises that had led to loss. Ships that sailed into predictable storms embodied the collision of human ambition and natural limitation. Their destruction was not an accident, nor the triumph of the sea over skill alone. It was the inevitable consequence of sending unprepared vessels into known peril. By the time waves rose, wind howled, and rain blinded the deck, the ship carried the accumulated weight of every decision that had compromised her safety from the outset. In the annals of maritime history, these losses were often recorded simply as storm losses. Yet for those who sailed, for those who witnessed, and for those who studied the wreckage afterward, it was clear the storm was not the sole culprit. It had merely completed the story begun in harbors, dockyards, and counting houses where economic necessity, human ambition, and disregard for structural limits had already set the stage for disaster. As ships struggled against waves, overburdened decks, leaking hulls, and exhausted crews, another, more insidious threat often emerged: the fracture of authority itself. Mutiny was not a sudden act of defiance, but a symptom of conditions that had been building long before the first rope snapped. On vessels that should never have sailed, desperation and fear combined with fatigue, disease, and mistrust to create an environment where the hierarchy of command could unravel with frightening speed. Mutiny was rarely born of ambition alone. Most sailors did not seek power, they sought survival. Yet when crews faced seemingly insurmountable challenges, a leaking ship, insufficient manpower, shifting cargo, or orders that risked their lives, they confronted an impossible question: obey and perish, or resist and risk punishment, drowning, or exile. The choice was framed not as moral, but as pragmatic. Desperation became a strategy for life itself. Pressed men and conscripted sailors were particularly volatile. They had no loyalty to the captain, the ship, or even the voyage. Every command was weighed against self-preservation. Illness, exhausted, and frustrated by conditions beyond their control, they often lacked the patience or energy to maintain discipline. Even small errors, ignored orders, or perceived incompetence by officers could trigger open rebellion, particularly when men concluded that the voyage was doomed regardless of compliance. The seeds of mutiny grew quietly at first. Crew members whispered of abandoning ship or refusing orders. Tasks were performed half-heartedly, mistakes tolerated until they accumulated into a crisis. Fear and mistrust eroded cohesion, making collective action more likely. In such moments, the line between survival and defiance blurred. Resistance became not a challenge to authority, but a desperate attempt to stay alive in a vessel that was failing from every direction. Mutiny was rarely simple. It did not erupt without reason or provoke solely by discontent. It was a calculated, chaotic response to conditions no sailor could remedy alone. When leadership failed to anticipate the effects of disease, fatigue, and structural weakness on morale, small grievances escalated. An officer E.S. order to pump out water could be met with hesitation or outright refusal if men believed the effort pointless. A command to adjust cargo or sails might be ignored when exhaustion had already sapped physical capacity. Violence often accompanied such uprisings. Clashes between officers and crew could result in injury or death even before the ship faced external hazards. A ship already compromised by rot or overload became exponentially more dangerous when human conflict interfered with essential operations. Leaks went unchecked, sails were mismanaged, and navigational mistakes multiplied under the stress of divided authority. Each moment of hesitation increased the likelihood of catastrophic loss. Psychological tension was constant. Sailors balanced fear of punishment with fear of the ship, knowing that obedience might not save them any more than rebellion. Decisions were fraught with consequence, calculated in real time against the unpredictable sea, unstable cargo, and failing hull. Mutiny was not merely rebellion. It was the final manifestation of prolonged exposure to unendurable conditions, a reflection of the impossibility of survival on a ship that should never have sailed. Officers faced impossible dilemmas. Punishing mutiny risked further destabilizing the crew, while inaction allowed disorder to grow. Experienced captains sometimes used negotiation, promises of reward, or strategic concessions to restore compliance, but such measures were temporary. Once trust had eroded and fear dominated decision-making, control was never fully regained. The balance between leadership and chaos was delicate and often tipped irreversibly by circumstance. Even after mutinies were suppressed or resolved, the effects lingered. Crews, already weakened by illness and fatigue, were demoralized further by conflict. Essential operations slowed or failed entirely. Tasks that had been manageable under calm, disciplined conditions became impossible under the strain of mistrust. Survival no longer depended solely on the ship's integrity or the skill of its crew. It depended on human cohesion, already frayed and brittle. Mutiny, therefore, was both a symptom and a consequence. Ships did not fail only from storms, disease, or overloading. They also failed because the human element under sustained duress fractured. Authority could collapse as surely as a rotten beam, and once it did, the voyage teetered on the edge of catastrophe. On ships that should never have sailed, mutiny was not an anomaly. It was a predictable outcome of compounding weaknesses, human and material alike. The tragedy of these events lies not only in the loss of life, but in the futility of the struggle. Men fought against each other because they could not fight against the ship itself. By the time mutiny erupted, the vessel's failure was already written into every creaking timber, leaking seam, and shifting load. The sea demanded a reckoning for choices made long before departure, and human desperation became the final act in a tragedy carefully set in motion on land. Even before the first storm broke the horizon, some ships carried within them a hidden, unacknowledged threat that could destroy all in an instant: fire. For vessels already compromised by structural weakness, overloading, disease, and human discord, a single spark could ignite disaster beyond repair. Fires did not always begin from recklessness. They often emerged from necessity, from the everyday activities of a ship trying to survive against impossible odds. Lighting, cooking, and heating, all essential for life aboard, were dangerous when confined to poorly ventilated, overcrowded spaces. Lanterns swung on chains, candles burned near timbers weakened by rot, and cooking fires shared space with stored cargo. Barrels of flammable liquids, tar, pitch, or gunpowder could be stored below deck for trade or defense. Any lapse in attention, a dropped ember, or a spilled oil lamp transformed routine activity into a catalyst for catastrophe. The risk of fire was compounded by the ship's design and cargo arrangement. Overloaded decks and tightly packed holds left little room to maneuver or contain flames. Once ignited, fire spread rapidly through dry wood, cloth, and barrels. Smoke filled passageways, choking the crew and passengers, reducing visibility and forcing them to abandon essential tasks. Pumping water became impossible, steering grew erratic, and coordination collapsed under the suffocating heat and confusion. Crew response depended entirely on training and morale, both of which were often compromised. Pressed men, ill sailors, and fearful passengers had neither the experience nor the will to fight flames effectively. Officers issued commands, but execution was hampered by panic and obstruction. When fire met exhaustion and disease, resistance became sporadic and disorganized. By the time the blaze was recognized, it often had progressed beyond the possibility of containment. Below deck, the consequences were particularly severe. Cargo could trap men, sealing their fate as flames consumed the ship's interior. Smoke inhalation incapacitated even the strongest, while heat warped timbers, opening seams and allowing water or additional fire to enter or spread. A single locked hatch could become a death trap, the only barrier between a man and destruction. Those who attempted escape faced chaos on deck, where collapsing rigging, rolling cargo, and a panicked crew compounded danger. Fire also magnified prior vulnerabilities. Overloaded ships listed more readily when men abandoned positions to fight flames. Rotten planks cracked under sudden thermal expansion. Water used to douse flames added weight to already overloaded hulls, causing further instability. The very tools meant to combat disaster, hoses, buckets, pumps, became ineffective in vessels already compromised by structural flaws, human frailty, and environmental conditions. Often, fire revealed human negligence as much as accident. Improperly stored flammable materials, unattended lanterns, and insufficient precautions reflected choices made in haste or driven by profit. Officers sometimes prioritize cargo or schedule over safety, unwilling to delay departure or reduce loads for the sake of caution. The same economic pressures that sent ships to sea overloaded and ill-crewed also made them vulnerable to catastrophe from something as seemingly mundane as a cooking fire. In accounts of maritime disasters, fire was frequently recorded with a tone of inevitability, as though the sea itself had conspired to consume the vessel. Survivors' testimonies, when preserved, spoke instead of human error, compounded by circumstances beyond control. The overcrowded holds, the weakened hull, the exhausted men, and the insufficient oversight. Fire was not merely an accident. It was a final act in a chain of compromises, a hazard preordained by decisions made long before the ship left the harbor. The psychological impact of fire was immediate and relentless. Panic overtook methodical action. Fear replaced training, and cohesion disintegrated. Sailors who might have survived storms or disease fell victim to flames in moments. Passengers trapped in holds or crowded decks faced suffocation or immolation. The ship itself became an arena of horror, a mechanical and human failure made manifest in heat, smoke, and cracking timber. In the broader arc of maritime history, fires aboard ships that should never have sailed were tragic reminders of compounding vulnerabilities. They demonstrated that no single hazard, storm, disease, overload, human error, operated in isolation. Rather, these dangers intersected, each amplifying the other, until catastrophe became unavoidable. Fire was often the most visible of these forces, consuming both wood and life, but it was only the final expression of a voyage compromised from the very beginning. Ships lost to fire carried a message that was repeated across centuries. The sea punishes negligence, and the convergence of human ambition, economic pressure, and environmental risk produces disaster far more certain than legend suggests. For those aboard, survival depended not on courage alone, but on the fragile interplay of factors already stacked against them, a balance too easily tipped by a single spark. The ocean, in its vast and merciless expanse, conceals threats far subtler than storms or fire, dangers that have claimed ships long before panic can set in or pumps fail to keep pace with flooding. Ships that should never have sailed were particularly vulnerable to these hidden perils, ice, fog, and currents that were both predictable and invisible, yet no less lethal. Unlike a tempest that announces itself with sound and fury, these hazards could strike silently, catching even the most vigilant crew unprepared, and magnifying every flaw already present in the vessel, its cargo, and its human occupants. In northern and polar waters, ice presented a danger as old as seafaring itself. Massive sheets of drifting ice, grounded or moving with tides, could tear a hull apart in seconds. For ships already compromised by poor construction, rotten timbers, or overloading, the encounter was often fatal. Even without a collision, the chilling proximity of ice altered the behavior of the ship. Cold water seeped into weakened seams, causing planking to shrink and become brittle. Ropes stiffened, sails lost flexibility, and deck surfaces froze, making movement treacherous for men who were already exhausted, ill, or undertrained. Sailors navigating these regions relied heavily on knowledge passed through experience. They studied wind patterns, seasonal ice charts, and currents, yet even the best guidance could not fully counter the limitations imposed by compromised vessels. Captains faced the impossible task of balancing risk against commercial or political pressure, sometimes leaving safe harbors prematurely, forced by contracts, schedules, or fear of losing profit. Decisions made under these pressures often carried human lives directly into the path of hidden hazard. Fog, equally deceptive, imposed a different kind of peril. Unlike ice, which could be seen and anticipated, dense fog cloaked the world in near complete invisibility. Ships that should never have sailed, already slow, overloaded, or difficult to maneuver, became almost blind when conditions thickened. Landmarks, other vessels, and dangerous shoals disappeared into a gray void, leaving crews to rely on incomplete charts, rudimentary compasses, or estimations of position. Each minor miscalculation risked catastrophic collision or grounding. In these conditions, the human element became paramount. Sailors, weakened by disease, malnourishment, or fatigue, faced heightened anxiety. Decisions normally guided by routine observation were replaced by guesswork. Officers attempted to maintain order and course, but even minor lapses, a misread compass, a misheard signal, a momentary hesitation, could result in disaster. Crew coordination, already strained by overloading, illness, or coercion, faltered under the disorienting effect of fog. Miscommunication could send men aloft to adjust sails unnecessarily or in the wrong direction, further destabilizing the ship's balance and speed. Currents, invisible to the eye but fully present in their power, compounded these dangers. Ships with compromised hulls and inexperienced or unwilling crews often drifted into dangerous waters, their progress miscalculated and their position misjudged. Strong currents could push vessels toward reefs, shoals, or shifting sandbars with deadly efficiency. Where soundings and observation might have prevented disaster, overworked or inexperienced crews were unable to compensate, and officers could not correct errors quickly enough. The ship's compromised state magnified every miscalculation, transforming manageable navigation challenges into lethal situations. The convergence of ice, fog, and currents created situations where survival depended less on skill and more on fortune. Even experienced captains could do little to prevent collisions with floating ice in dense fog, and overloading or weak construction made escape from such encounters impossible. The sea, silent and impartial, revealed failures of design, preparation, and human judgment with cruel inevitability. Every flaw in the ship or its operation was amplified, every human weakness exposed. For the crew, these hazards imposed extraordinary psychological strain. Navigating blind through fog while aware of ice nearby or strong currents beneath them created constant tension. Anxiety intensified fatigue, and fear hampered judgment. The very skills that might have ensured survival, rapid response, coordinated effort, precise measurement, were undermined by the conditions of the voyage and the compromised state of the vessel. Pressed men, conscripted sailors, or ill crews struggled to execute even the simplest commands, their ability to act compromised by exhaustion and terror. The threat extended below deck as well. Cold from ice-laden waters seeped into cabins and cargo holds, further weakening already fragile sailors. Damp, dark conditions encouraged disease, compounding the slow attrition of health that had begun before departure. The interconnection between environmental hazard, structural compromise, and human frailty became starkly apparent. The ship's survival depended on the simultaneous functioning of vessel, cargo, and crew, yet all three were already compromised. Even minor incidents could escalate rapidly under these conditions. A slight collision with an ice floe could breach a hull weakened by rot, allowing water to flood cargo and crew quarters. A misjudged tack in fog could push the ship into a strong current, causing cargo to shift dangerously and decks to list. The human response, slow, panicked, or misdirected, added to the mechanical failure. In such moments, the line between accident and inevitability blurred, and survival became a matter of chance rather than skill. Accounts from survivors often described these experiences as surreal. Men spoke of silence broken only by the groaning of timber and the sound of water against hull, visibility reduced to a few yards, and landmarks lost to mist. Panic was not immediate, but crept in as hours passed without certainty of position or safety. These conditions magnified every flaw in the ship, every shortcoming in preparation, and every weakness among the crew. A vessel that might have survived ordinary conditions became almost guaranteed to fail when confronted by hidden, pervasive hazards. In hindsight, these dangers were not the result of unpredictability alone. Ships that sailed into ice-laden waters, fog banks, or treacherous currents often did so with knowledge of the risks, constrained by human pressures and economic imperatives. Decisions to leave port, to carry excessive cargo, or to ignore crew fatigue were made deliberately, yet their consequences were deferred until the vessel was at sea. The hidden perils of ice, fog, and currents merely exposed what had already been compromised. Ultimately, these invisible hazards served as a quiet arbiter of human ambition, reinforcing the lesson that the sea tolerates no compromise. Ships overloaded, poorly constructed, ill-crewed, or ill-prepared were vulnerable not only to storms and fire, but to the silent threats of navigation, concealment, and relentless environmental forces. Ice and fog did not attack indiscriminately. They revealed truths, unmasking the limitations of human preparation, judgment, and endurance. On vessels that should never have sailed, these hazards often became the final agents of destruction, claiming lives that had already been endangered by every preceding failure. In the ledger of maritime history, these losses are recorded with stark brevity: lost in fog, crushed by ice, struck shoal. Yet each notation represents a convergence of countless failures, structural, human, and environmental. The lesson is timeless. The sea, impartial and observant, exposes what is unsound, unforgivingly, with an efficiency that no storm, fire, or mutiny alone could match. Ships that should never have sailed, when confronted with hidden perils, proved the truth that had been present from the moment they left port. Survival depends on preparation, integrity, and an unflinching respect for the forces beyond human control. The ocean, vast and unending to the eye, is never empty. Even in the remotest waters, ships intersect, converge, and sometimes collide, often with devastating consequences. Vessels that should never have sailed carried within them not only structural flaws, overloading, and human frailty, but also the ever-present danger of encountering another vessel at the wrong moment. Collisions were seldom accidents in the romantic sense. They were the result of compounding weaknesses, human misjudgment, and environmental concealment that made navigation a perilous endeavor. These ships, burdened by cargo beyond capacity, sailed sluggishly and unpredictably. Their compromised hulls and overworked crews struggled to respond to sudden maneuvers or changes in course by other vessels. Even experienced captains, aware of maritime traffic patterns and regulations, could find themselves helpless when confronted by an approaching ship in fog, darkness, or a sudden squall. The margin for error was already razor thin. The presence of another vessel reduced it to near impossibility. Human error played a critical role. Lookouts, often ill-trained or exhausted, misjudged distances and speed. Officers, pressed to maintain schedules, sometimes failed to alter course and time. On congested trade routes, the slightest miscalculation could place two ships on a collision path. Overloaded cargo affected turning ability, delayed response to the helm, and prevented rapid course correction. Even minor contact could rupture weakened hulls, break spars, and send rigging tumbling, initiating a chain reaction of disaster. Fog, nightfall, and storms amplified the risk of collision. Visibility was reduced to a few yards, and sound, bells, horns, or shouting, was muffled by wind, rain, or waves. Sailors relied on instinct as much as skill, but instinct faltered under fatigue and fear. Pressed men, untrained and unwilling, often misinterpreted orders or froze in hesitation. The human and mechanical elements of the ship, already stressed by disease and exhaustion, became unpredictable in the face of sudden threat. Collisions could happen in harbor as well as at sea. Ships departing ports crowded with vessels bound for distant destinations often encountered traffic they could neither anticipate nor avoid. Overloaded ships maneuvered sluggishly, unable to respond quickly to other vessels' movements. Minor impacts against a dock, another ship, or even floating debris could damage planking, loosen cargo, or compromise structural integrity. These incidents, seemingly small at the time, often set the stage for catastrophic failure later on open waters. The consequences of collision were magnified by prior compromises. A ship with weakened timbers or poorly secured cargo could be crippled by an impact that a sound vessel would have survived. Water entered through seams already strained by overloading, forcing men to work pumps incessantly. Injured crew or passengers further strained human resources. A damaged mast or broken rudder rendered navigation difficult, if not impossible. Each successive hazard compounded the previous, creating a cascade of failures that left survival a matter of luck rather than skill. The psychological effect on sailors was profound. Every encounter with another vessel carried the potential for instant disaster. Awareness of the ship's fragility created a heightened sense of tension, where even ordinary maneuvers could provoke dread. Crew members were constantly on edge, expecting disaster from every direction. Fear and anticipation, mingled with exhaustion, disease, and physical strain, increased the likelihood of mistakes, forming a self-reinforcing cycle of vulnerability. Many collisions were silent tragedies, their causes concealed from official records. Vessels could founder hours after impact, with witnesses attributing loss to storms or misfortune rather than the initial strike. Survivors often recalled only fragments, a sudden jolt, a crash of timber, or the splintering of the deck. The slow accumulation of hidden damage rather than immediate destruction was the hallmark of these events. Ships might continue for days or weeks before failure became inevitable, their weakness invisible until disaster arrived. The threat was compounded in wartime or piracy-prone waters. Ships avoided detection while pursuing speed or stealth, trading caution for strategic advantage. Navigation errors in these conditions increased the likelihood of collision. In addition, rival vessels could exploit weaknesses, ramming or cornering a compromised ship to devastating effect. Even when no enemy was present, the proximity of other ships on busy trade routes created a constant hazard that few could evade entirely. Collisions underscored a critical truth about ships that should never have sailed. Human, material, and environmental factors intersect in ways that amplify danger. Every flaw in construction, every error in judgment, Every exhausted hand, every poorly secured barrel, every moment of miscalculation could magnify the threat of an encounter with another vessel. The sea was impartial, and in the case of ships already compromised, encounters with others were rarely survivable. In this way, the ocean itself became a relentless arbiter. It revealed flaws in preparation, highlighted weaknesses in design, and exposed errors in human decision-making. Ships that should never have sailed were tested not only by storms, disease fire, and fatigue, but also by the ceaseless presence of other vessels, living reminders that survival at sea depended on the seamless integration of human skill, ship integrity, and respect for the environment. Failure in any domain made collision almost inevitable, and once it occurred, the consequences were catastrophic, irreversible, and indiscriminate. These incidents of collision, often minimized in official logs, were in reality a reflection of accumulated compromise. They demonstrated that danger was not confined to dramatic storms or visible hazards alone. Ships, already burdened by structural weakness, disease, fatigue, and human discontent, were vulnerable in every direction. The presence of other ships, whether near or far, visible or concealed, magnified those vulnerabilities and ensured that the voyage was as much a struggle against fellow men and vessels as it was against the sea itself. Even as sailors fought storms, disease, fire, and collisions, the most persistent threat to ships that should never have sailed was less immediate, less visible, but no less deadly: time itself. The relentless work of wind, salt, water, and sun eroded every advantage a vessel might have carried from its construction yard to the open ocean. What might have begun as a seaworthy ship, if pressed, overloaded, or poorly maintained, became increasingly fragile with every passing day at sea. The betrayal was slow, subtle, and cumulative, yet it left few survivors when fully realized. Timber, the very backbone of these vessels, succumbed quietly to the elements. Salt water crept into seams, slowly weakening planks. Sun and wind dried exposed surfaces, causing warping and fissures. The swelling and shrinking of wood under daily temperature and moisture changes created gaps that allowed water, ingress, rot, and structural stress. Every leak pumped by desperate sailors was a temporary reprieve, a patch that concealed the inexorable march of decay. Iron fastenings, nails, and bolts fared no better. Corrosion ate quietly, hidden behind planks and below decks. A single crucial joint, weakened by rust, could fail under pressure, and failure rarely struck in isolation. Timbers that had been held together by these fastenings flexed differently with each passing day, altering the ship's balance and response to wind and waves. In vessels already overloaded or misconstructed, this subtle degradation compounded, reducing the margin for error to almost nothing. Ropes, lines, and rigging experienced their own slow decay. Constant friction, exposure to salt, and intermittent neglect weakened fibers. Sails, once taut and reliable, frayed along edges, lost shape, and failed under the strain of maneuvering. A rope that held yesterday might snap today. A spar that bore the weight of a gale last week could splinter under moderate wind. Time transformed reliability into vulnerability, and vulnerability into fatality. The crew, too, was subject to time's quiet assault. Fatigue, disease, and malnutrition eroded their physical and mental capacities day by day. Even the strongest men could endure only so long. Muscle weakened, reflex slowed, and judgment faltered. Those responsible for maintaining pumps, adjusting sails, or securing cargo became increasingly incapable, turning minor hazards into major threats. Human endurance, already stretched to its limits, proved temporary, like the rotting wood around them. Cumulative wear and tear on the ship. S-systems was often invisible until the moment it mattered most. A hatch might loosen gradually, a seam might start to leak imperceptibly, a mast might flex under increasing strain. Sailors learned to recognize warning signs, but in vessels already compromised, by the time these signs were evident, the damage was often irreversible. The line between minor maintenance and catastrophic failure blurred as daily use accelerated deterioration beyond repair. Cargo, which had been loaded without regard for weight distribution or stability, further amplified the effects of wear. Heavy barrels, crates, and provisions shifted subtly with each swell, introducing stress points in the hull and deck that worsened with every passing hour. The ship flexed unevenly, timber splintered, and rigging strained. These cumulative stresses, invisible on departure, manifested as sudden crises weeks or months into the voyage, making even moderate weather or ordinary maneuvers perilous. Even navigation instruments, though cared for, degraded over time. Compasses might lose calibration, sextants' mirrors tarnished, charts faded or torn. Small errors compounded over long distances, especially when the crew was weakened and the ship less responsive. The invisible erosion of reliability extended beyond structure into every facet of the voyage. Each day was a negotiation between decay and survival, a contest few ships survived. Psychologically, the knowledge of slow decay was as dangerous as its physical consequences. Sailors familiar with the signs, creaking timbers, sagging masts, persistent leaks, lived under constant tension. Every minor failure reminded them of the greater, inexorable threat. Anxiety and anticipation of disaster further eroded performance, amplifying fatigue, misjudgment, and errors. Human awareness of vulnerability did little to mitigate the relentless effects of time. If anything, it accelerated collapse by undermining confidence and cohesion. Time also revealed the compounded consequences of earlier human decisions. A hull weakened by poor construction, a deck overloaded, cargo mismanaged, disease left untreated, or fatigued crews were all factors magnified by the persistent erosion of the ship itself. In many cases, disaster was not immediate. It was a slow unraveling, where each passing day brought the ship closer to irrecoverable failure. Survivors often described the experience as a gradual horror, a sense that everything was decaying around them and within them, leaving only the relentless inevitability of the end. This slow betrayal was merciless. Unlike storms, which offered warning, or fire, which could be detected and sometimes fought, decay operated silently, unheralded, and continuous. It transformed ordinary voyages into precarious journeys, where every task required more effort than the last, every maneuver demanded greater vigilance, and every decision carried heightened risk. Ships that might have endured weeks at sea became casualties of compounded weakness, victims not of a single catastrophe, but of accumulation over time. Maritime records seldom captured the quiet destruction wrought by slow decay. Official reports attributed loss to storms, human error, or misfortune, rarely acknowledging the persistent wear that preceded these events. Yet survivors' testimonies tell a different story. Ships weakened gradually by time, compromised from construction to cargo, carried their own doom with every mile. The sea did not need to strike with fury. It merely demanded endurance, and the ship's own deterioration ensured it could not meet that challenge. In the final analysis, the slow betrayal of time was a truth all mariners eventually learned. A ship compromised from the outset could not resist the cumulative effects of the environment, its own structure, or the relentless demands of a voyage. On vessels that should never have sailed, decay was an unyielding adversary, ensuring that sooner or later disaster became inevitable, no matter the skill, courage, or determination of those aboard. Even in the vast expanse of the ocean, danger rarely exists in isolation. Ships that should never have sailed were not only vulnerable to storms, disease, and structural failure, they were also prey to other humans, men who thrived on the desperation and weakness of those aboard. Piracy, long romanticized in legend, was in reality a precise, ruthless, and often deadly threat that exploited every vulnerability in a compromised vessel. For ships already burdened by overloading, fatigue, disease, and structural compromise, encounters with pirates could become the final, decisive calamity. Pirates observed, planned, and waited. They understood the patterns of trade, the rhythms of ports, and the weaknesses of poorly maintained vessels. Merchant ships, overloaded with cargo, undermanned, or poorly armed, became prime targets. The physical limitations imposed by their own compromises made them easy prey, slow to maneuver, vulnerable below decks, and unable to respond effectively to sudden threats. A ship sailing with a fatigued crew, leaking hull, and compromised timbers was already fighting against itself. Add a calculated human threat, and survival became a matter of near impossible odds. The approach of pirates often began with observation from a distance. Men aboard the attacking vessel studied sails, hull condition, and crew movements, calculating not only the risk of resistance, but the probability of success. They knew that desperation weakened judgment, and that disease or fatigue sapped physical capacity. Pirates did not rely on brute force alone. They exploited weakness, psychological strain, and strategic opportunity. In this way, human predation was as much a test of a ship's pre-existing vulnerabilities as a demonstration of external threat. When pirates attacked, chaos erupted almost immediately. Crew members, already weakened by fatigue, illness, or overwork, were forced to respond under extreme pressure. Sails had to be adjusted, lines secured, cargo protected, and weapons manned, all while the ship might already be listing, leaking, or otherwise compromised. Mistakes, hesitation, or inability to follow orders had amplified consequences. One misplaced maneuver could allow boarding, capsizing, or the loss of critical cargo. The compounding vulnerabilities of the ship became a force multiplier for the pirates' advantage. On deck, the human struggle was brutal. Armed confrontation combined with environmental hazards, swelling waves, slippery surfaces, and rigging hazards intensified risk. Those already weakened by illness or fatigue were at a distinct disadvantage. Their reflexes dulled, their strength diminished. Boarding actions were swift and merciless. Pirates exploited every weakness, whether structural, logistical, or human. Crew who might have survived storms or disease found themselves unable to resist human aggression, a testament to the interplay of vulnerability and opportunity. Below deck, the situation was even more dire. Passengers, confined in cramped quarters, faced both fear and the risk of injury from cargo shifted by the attack. Those seeking to help were impeded by illness, exhaustion, or inadequate access to key areas of the ship. Fires, leaks, or rigging failures, compounded by the assault, made survival even less likely. Human predation became intertwined with the existing failures of the vessel, turning the ship itself into an instrument of mortality. Piracy was not merely an attack, it was an exploitation of existing weakness. Pirates understood that a vessel carrying fatigue-ridden crews, disease, structural compromise, or poorly trained sailors was more likely to surrender without prolonged resistance. Economic motives intertwined with strategic acumen. A quick capture ensured maximum profit while minimizing risk. Ships that should never have sailed were particularly tempting targets, their vulnerabilities already setting the stage for rapid defeat. The psychological toll of encountering pirates was immense. Men were forced to act with precision and courage under conditions of extreme stress, already compounded by prior hardships. Anxiety, fear, and desperation eroded decision-making, and panic could spread contagiously through the crew and passengers alike. Even experienced officers struggled to maintain order, knowing that one misstep might render all prior effort meaningless. Human predation exploited the weakest links, making survival as much a matter of luck as skill. Piracy incidents often left a permanent mark on maritime memory. Survivors recounted the terror of being overpowered, the chaos of combat, and the helplessness of seeing a ship already compromised succumb further. Cargo lost, crew killed, or the vessel burned or scuttled were common outcomes. Even those who survived carried knowledge of human vulnerability, amplified by the unforgiving conditions of sea travel. Ships that had been compromised long before departure rarely survived encounters with other men as intact entities. Predation revealed the final consequences of compounded failure. In history, piracy is frequently portrayed as a singular adventure or isolated event. In reality, it was an inevitable hazard layered atop every other risk a ship carried. A vessel compromised by overloading, disease, structural weakness, fatigue, misjudgment, or environmental threats was far more likely to be captured or destroyed. Human predation at sea was not a mere gamble. It was a calculated exploitation of the weaknesses already present in those ships that should never have sailed. Ultimately, piracy underscored a universal truth about maritime vulnerability. The sea alone was not the sole arbiter of survival. Human threat, as deliberate and intelligent as storms and disease were indiscriminate, intersected with existing weaknesses to create compounded, almost unstoppable disaster. Ships already compromised were rarely lucky. Their encounters with predators were simply another inevitable step in a chain of cumulative risk, each factor feeding into the next until catastrophe became not only possible but almost certain. Ships lost to piracy were not merely casualties of greed or violence. They were living testaments to the consequences of sending vessels to sea that were already burdened with human, structural, and environmental compromise. The ocean itself remained impartial, but human predators exploited its victims with ruthless efficiency, turning a voyage that should have been survivable into a tragedy from which few could escape. While storms, fire, collisions, and human predation were immediate and visible threats, perhaps the most insidious danger to ships that should never have sailed was invisible: disease. Unlike wind or waves, illness did not announce itself with creaking timbers or crashing waves. It spread silently, methodically, often before a single sailor recognized the danger. On vessels already compromised by overloading, poor nutrition, and fatigue, disease became an agent of both human and operational collapse, eroding the strength, judgment, and morale of those aboard. Ships were crowded, air was stagnant, and sanitation was minimal. Sailors and passengers lived in close quarters, sharing narrow bunks, contaminated water, and food that spoiled in the heat. Illness spread swiftly. Scurvy, dysentery, typhus, and smallpox moved like shadows through decks, holds, and cabins. A single infected individual could seed an outbreak that would cripple a crew before a storm, fire, or enemy ship even arrived on the horizon. The consequences were immediate and compounding. Sick men could not perform essential tasks, leaving pumps unattended, sails unadjusted, and cargo unsecured. Fatigue, already heightened by long hours at sea, combined with fever and malnutrition, slowed reactions, dulled judgment, and increased mistakes. Tasks that required coordination became impossible, and every failure amplified the ship's vulnerability to the environment. Illness turned ordinary hazards into deadly threats. The human mind, weakened by fever and exhaustion, became as much a casualty as the body. Panic and despair spread almost as quickly as disease itself. Sailors grew fearful not only of the sea but of one another, aware that any human contact could spread contagion. Tensions escalated into conflict. Arguments over rations, tasks, or responsibilities ignited easily, further undermining authority and cohesion. Mutiny, already a risk on vessels that should never have sailed, became more likely when disease sapped both energy and patience. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, remedies were limited, and care was often ineffective. Surgeons, when present, were constrained by the resources of the ship, crude tools, insufficient medicines, and minimal understanding of contagion. Isolation of the sick was nearly impossible in the tight confines of the hold, and those assigned to care for them risked illness themselves. Every attempt to combat disease was hampered by the very conditions that made the ship unfit to sail in the first place. Nutrition played a decisive role in vulnerability. Ships pressed to sail quickly often carried inadequate provisions. Fresh fruits, vegetables, and clean water were scarce, replaced by salted meat and hardtack that quickly lost nutritional value. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, struck with precision, leaving men weak, bleeding, and incapable of performing essential duties. Fatigue and illness interacted in a vicious cycle. Weakened men performed poorly, which increased risk and stress, further exacerbating physical decline. Disease also influenced morale profoundly. Crew members witnessed friends, neighbors, and fellow sailors succumb to illness without relief. Fear of contagion bred suspicion. Some refused to assist the sick, while others avoided critical duties out of self-preservation. In some cases, the psychological strain of illness spread faster than the disease itself, creating panic and undermining the chain of command. Even minor tasks became fraught with danger when every touch, every shared utensil, and every confined space carried potential infection. Historically, ships lost to disease often appear in records as foundered or abandoned, as though nature alone were responsible. Survivor accounts, however, reveal a slower, more agonizing process. Men weakened by illness could not bail water, adjust sails, repel attackers, or even climb to safety. The ship's structure, already compromised, became unmanageable, and each hazard, storm, fire, collision, piracy, was magnified by the human toll of disease. The invisible enemy transformed every other threat into an almost certain fatality. In this context, disease was more than a physical challenge. It was a force that reshaped the very dynamics of the voyage. Sick men could not execute commands, undermining authority. Panic and despair spread, fracturing discipline. Coordination failed at moments when precision could have averted disaster. The sea itself, unforgiving as it was, became an extension of disease, punishing compromised bodies and compromised ships alike. The cumulative effect of illness was evident in every aspect of maritime failure. Pumps ran dry, sails went untrimmed, cargo shifted, and even defensive measures became ineffective. Ships that might have survived storms or attacks succumbed because disease had hollowed out the crew's capacity to act. Every decision to sail an overloaded, poorly maintained, or inadequately provisioned ship brought these consequences closer to inevitability. Disease was, ultimately, an impartial arbiter. It did not discriminate between skill, rank, or courage. Its impact was determined by conditions aboard and decisions made before departure. Vessels pressed to sail despite weak crews, limited provisions, and inadequate medical knowledge carried within them the seeds of their own demise. On ships that should never have sailed, disease was both a mirror and a magnifier. It revealed existing weaknesses and accelerated every other threat toward catastrophe. In the annals of maritime history, disease stands as one of the deadliest, least acknowledged agents of shipwreck. It was not the roar of the storm or the crash of a wave that doomed so many, but the quiet, relentless spread of illness through already strained human and structural systems. Ships carried the weight of human ambition, environmental hazard, and mechanical compromise, and disease ensured that the consequences were paid in full, with lives lost silently, methodically, and inescapably. By the time a ship reached the final stage of its doomed voyage, it carried within its timbers, its rigging, and its crew a compounding weight of every hazard imaginable. Storms had tested its hull, fire had scarred its decks, ice and fog had hidden danger, Collisions had bruised its structure. Piracy had threatened every cargo hold. Decay had weakened its very framework, and disease had hollowed the strength of men who once might have turned the tide. Each of these forces alone was perilous. Together, they formed a convergence that few vessels could withstand, a perfect storm of compounded vulnerability that rendered survival an improbable lottery. As the crew battled fatigue, illness, and fear, the ship itself groaned and trembled under the relentless pressure of human and natural forces. Water seeped through weakened seams, threatening to flood the hold. Masts strained against wind, and shifting sails and ropes frayed, threatening to unravel the ship's very means of propulsion. Each wave, each gust of wind, and each sudden movement of cargo magnified the weaknesses previously invisible or manageable. The cumulative effect was both mechanical and psychological. The vessel's frailty mirrored the men's exhaustion, and the sea exploited both with impartial precision. In these moments, the interplay of threats became starkly apparent. A storm might capsize an overloaded deck, but weakened hulls and frayed rigging made recovery impossible. A fire, once ignited, spread faster as exhausted men were unable to fight it effectively, while disease sapped those assigned to contain it. Collision with debris or another vessel compounded the damage. Pirates or enemy ships exploited the chaos. Every failure interacted, creating a chain reaction that left little hope for correction. The vessel was no longer simply a ship. It had become a crucible of compounded failure. Human responses, too, reflected the inevitability of catastrophe. Crew coordination had frayed through fatigue, illness, and fear. Orders were delayed or ignored, and minor mistakes became fatal. Panic, already present in earlier stages of the voyage, erupted in full force. Sailors, passengers, and officers alike faced impossible choices, their judgment clouded by exhaustion and desperation. Courage alone was insufficient. Skill alone was meaningless. Survival required a vessel as resilient as the sea, and none existed on ships that should never have sailed. Even the most competent captains were powerless in the face of such convergence. Decisions that might have preserved the ship earlier, reducing load, delaying departure, reinforcing hulls, or limiting exposure to extreme weather, were moot. The vessel had been compromised from the start, and time had magnified every flaw. The final reckoning was inevitable, because it was not a single event, but the culmination of a sequence of failures, each dependent on the previous, each inexorably moving toward disaster. The sea, silent and impartial, became both judge and executioner. It revealed the consequences of overreach, of compromised design, of mismanaged crews and cargo. Its waves and ones did not distinguish between skill or courage. They simply exploited weakness. Even the slightest advantage, an intact hull, a competent crew, a favorable current, could not overcome the compounded threats that pressed upon the vessel from every direction. Ships that should never have sailed were consumed not by a singular calamity, but by the convergence of hazards that had been building long before they left port. In the final moments, the human cost became absolute. Lives were lost to drowning, fire, disease, or violent encounters. Desperate men clung to floating debris, to one another, or to whatever fragment of the ship remained intact. The physical and psychological toll reached its zenith. Exhaustion, panic, and despair merged into a singular struggle for survival. For those who perished, the voyage had become a relentless, inescapable cycle of compounded hazard, leaving no room for mercy, error, or recovery. The wrecks of these ships tell a story beyond logs, charts, and economic records. They reveal the consequences of human ambition pressed beyond limits, of structural compromise, of environmental hazard, of misjudgment, and of human frailty. Each lost vessel was a testament to the intersection of mechanical failure, environmental forces, and human vulnerability. They became floating warnings to those who followed, though often those warnings went unheeded. Even survivors bore the weight of convergence. Few emerged unscarred, either physically or mentally. Trauma, loss, and fear shaped the remainder of their lives. They had witnessed the sea exploit every flaw, punish every error, and magnify every weakness. Their testimony provided insight into the compounded nature of maritime disaster. It was never one storm, one fire, one misstep alone, but the sum of many, each amplifying the other. Ultimately, the story of ships that should never have sailed is the story of inevitability rendered through human, mechanical, and natural interaction. It is not merely a history of loss, but a chronicle of interconnected hazards, of the relentless accumulation of vulnerabilities, and of the precise, impartial forces of nature that punished overreach. The convergence of threats, storms, fire, collisions, piracy, decay, disease, human error, and environmental hazards created disasters that were never sudden, never entirely unpredictable, but long in the making, a culmination of decisions, compromises, and chance. These final moments, however tragic, also illuminate the reality of maritime life in historical context. They reveal the fragility of human endeavor against the elements, the vulnerability inherent in overloading, and the ultimate impartiality of the sea. Ships that should never have sailed stand as enduring monuments to the perils of ambition unchecked by preparation, courage diminished by fatigue, and human effort constrained by the inexorable forces of nature. The convergence of all these threats marks the end of the voyage, a final reckoning in which the sea, as always, remains sovereign, impartial, and absolute.